Hello, Van Weigel here, and welcome to this presentation on the distinction between deontology and teleology. Now, as this cartoon suggests, what I'm going to maintain in this presentation is that this distinction between deontology and teleology is like two people looking at the same thing from different perspectives, but seeing something different. In this case, four pieces of wood on the ground over against three. So in some respects, the idea of deontology and teleology is similar to visual perception and will depend on the starting point, if you will, of the perspective of the person making the observation. Now, in order to discuss these two concepts, I want you to consider at a very basic level the anatomy of an action or policy. First, we have people or a person. We'll call those agents. Those are people who act. They might be acting individually, and so they are producing by their decisions and their agency a action. They may also, though, be acting collaboratively with others and then creating a policy through those actions. And those actions or policies then generate their own set of outcomes based on what likely will transpire if that action is done or that policy is put into place. Now, from the standpoint of somebody who is a deontologist, the focal point of concern is the action or policy itself as opposed to the outcome of that action or policy. Deontology is derived from the Greek word deon, which means duty or obligation, and ology is referring to the study of or the controlled discussion of obligation in this sense. So deontology refers to the study of obligation. And so if somebody is a deontologist, they're going to be focused on evaluating, is this action or policy right or wrong in its own regard, in its own right, over against the potential outcomes of that action or policy. Now, teleology is based on the Greek word telos, meaning end, and so this would refer to the study of ends. And basically, the focal point of someone who is a teleologist will be looking at the outcome of a particular action or policy. Are those outcomes largely good or are they bad? And if they are largely good, desirable outcomes, then a teleologist would say that particular action or policy is right. If they are bad outcomes, then that action or policy would be wrong. But the key point of a teleological perspective is that one really can't get at the goodness, the rightness or wrongness of an action or policy without first looking at the goodness or badness of a particular outcome. Now, philosophers have often used a trolley example to sort of get at this idea of consequences and the importance of consequences for ethical decision making. I am not terribly drawn to the trolley example, as I'll explain in just a moment, but let me lay out to you the basic idea here. Here we have a representation of a trolley car that is passing underneath the footbridge, and you see two people on top of the footbridge, and then one person operating a switch. And this example typically starts by focusing on that person who's operating a switch and putting you in the situation of saying, what if you had to make this draconian decision of operating this switch on a runaway trolley car, knowing that there were 5 workmen on the track, but you could divert that car onto another track from which there is just one person who would be working on the track. And so the ethical dilemma is, yes, no, you don't every life is of incalculable significance. But in this situation, would it be necessary for you ethically to try to divert this train so as to prevent 5 people from losing their lives, even though that action is going to lead to the death of someone else on the tracks? And most people obviously would have to opt into these very difficult circumstances with diverting the train in order to save 5 people, even though that involves killing one of them. Although, in my way of thinking about this, that does make sense, but as a probabilistic statement, it is quite likely that one of the 5 who is working on the track is going to see that this train is headed in their direction out of control and warn everyone else. So, if you stood the course, maybe nobody has to die, but that's not how this particular example is set up. Then the part 2 of the example is where things get interesting, and that is you're on a footbridge, and for some reason you have the intuitive ability to know that this trolley is out of control, and you see what is happening here. There is no one actually operating the switch, but 5 people's lives will be endangered if you can't stop the trolley. Now, here's where things get weird as far as I'm concerned in the example, because the footbridge idea is, okay, you are not a particularly heavy person, but you see someone nearby who is a heavy person, and maybe they're carrying a large backpack. And so your thought is that in order to stop this train, I have to push this person off the footbridge into the tracks in order to stop the train to save the 5 people. And what comes out of this is that most people are very reticent in actually taking action themselves to physically push another person off the bridge to their death, with the hope that that stops the trolley and saves the 5 people who are on the track. Most people do not like the idea of actually taking that direct intervention, as opposed to the earlier example of flipping the switch. Now, what bothers me about this example is there is no one who has, passed successfully a high school physics course that knows that a human being, it doesn't matter how much they weigh, how much their backpack weighs that they're carrying, there is no physical way that a human being stops a trolley train. All that means is that instead of 5 people dying, now there are going to be 6 people who are dead. And so this absolutely makes no sense to me whatsoever. I don't want to be standing anywhere on a train platform where somebody is like going through an ethical, dilemma in their mind that involves throwing me on the tracks, because it just wouldn't work in the first place. So that's why I'm not too thrilled of the trolley example, even though it is quoted endlessly among philosophers. But you get the idea. Now, I am partial to these 4 case studies that I'd like to run you through: the San Francisco earthquake, 1989, the Southern Sheriff, 1953, the South American Botanist, 1976, and the New York City Police Chief. Now, there's no date on this, and so you could think of this in a contemporary sense. Although I will say this dilemma of the New York City Police Chief that involves a thermonuclear weapon placed in Manhattan does have some basis in reality. A little known fact is that shortly after 9/11, the intelligence services of the United States had very good intelligence to indicate that Al-Qaeda had planned a follow-up action that would involve the detonation of a backpack nuclear weapon in New York City. You can just imagine that President Bush and his administration were sweating bullets as September 11th moved into the end of September into October, because it was rumored this was going to take place in October. And thankfully, it's something that never happened. Now, what I'm going to suggest to you as we move through these case studies is that you likely, by habit of mind, tend toward either a deontological perspective or a teleological perspective, but that is not something that's rigid and unchanging. And indeed, your use of these two moral ways of perceiving an action can shift, as I think that we'll see as you answer these questions yourself. As we move through the case studies. So it's like you might have a tendency to do this, be a deontologist, teleologist, but it may not be an airtight kind of tendency. We began with the San Francisco earthquake, 1989. You are a third-year medical student studying at the University of California, Berkeley. It is October 17th, 1989. You are driving home from working a 12-hour shift at one of your rotation assignments, a pediatrics clinic in South Oakland. It is slightly after 5 o'clock p.m. You are traveling the double-decker freeway known as Interstate I-880. Suddenly, your car begins to shake violently. The pavement rolls like waves, and the cars ahead of you are tossed about like toys. Your body tenses with fear. You immediately slam on the brakes and try to control the car. Within less than a minute, the ground settles. You get out of the car, disoriented, staggering toward the front of the car, gripping the hood in a state of shock. A few yards ahead of you, the pavement drops off. Cautiously, you approach the edge of the pavement. You see a car, what appears to be a limousine, that is split in two by a long piece of reinforced concrete. The car is located about 7 feet below the edge of the pavement. Instinctively, you climb down the gnarled steel rods of the exposed concrete and leap on the trunk of the limousine. The markings on the back of the car identify it as an airport limousine. Suddenly, you are filled with horror. Your mother was due to arrive that afternoon at Oakland International Airport from a trip to the Orient. You peer through a broken window and see the driver and two passengers. After calling out to see if anyone is conscious, the driver responds that he is pinned underneath the steering column and collapsed dashboard. You ask if he is bleeding. He says no, but he thinks his right leg is broken. The two other passengers appear to be unconscious. You climb through the window to get a better look at them. Your worst fears are true. Your mother is one of the passengers. At first, you feel overwhelmed with emotion, but you immediately take control of your feelings and try to respond to the situation as a medical professional. Your mother is bleeding profusely. Next to your mother is a man who is strikingly familiar. Suddenly you realize that he is one of Berkeley's top cancer researchers, twice nominated for the Nobel Prize in Biochemistry. He, like your mother, is unconscious and bleeding profusely. In your professional opinion, both passengers are in equally grave medical condition. Moreover, under the physical circumstances of the accident, it is apparent that it is physically impossible for you to help both of the passengers at once. So, in this situation, who would you try to save? A, your mother, or B, the cancer researcher? Now, those that would opt for a deontological position would say your mother, because you owe your mother everything. She brought you into this world. She cared for you. Are you going to abandon her in this time of in her time of need? Sometimes, though, people still staying within a deontological perspective might say that they would save the cancer researcher, but only because they know for sure that his or her mother's wishes would be to save the person who could help other people medically combat cancer, and that she would want to give her life for that. So that would be done out of respect for your mother's point of view, and could be understood as an example of moving more to the cancer researcher side of things even though you're doing that out of respect for your mother. Now, B, of course, would be the purely teleological standpoint of you're going to save the person who likely has the ability to contribute most to the health and well-being of others. Your mother's a lovely person. She's adding to the economy of Hong Kong, Singapore, and other locations on her shopping trips, but she does not have the ability, like the cancer researcher, to impact large numbers of people in a really favorable way. So from a utilitarian standpoint, a teleological standpoint, the cancer researcher would be the person to save in this situation. Now, the next case is called the Southern Sheriff, and it asks us to reflect anachronistically on a situation in a small town in 1953. And remember, in the context of the typical small town sheriff, he has immense power to actually convict people, apprehend them and convict them, and to bring them to justice, because we're talking about having all the ability of the police person and the district attorney and the judge pretty much wrapped up in the office of the sheriff. It is the summer of 1953. You are the sheriff of a small, sleepy town in Mississippi. Approximately 70% of the town's citizens are white, and the other 30% are black. Last night, at approximately 9:45 p.m., a 16-year-old white girl was assaulted and raped while she was walking home from a friend's house. Because it was dark and the girl was severely frightened and disoriented, she was not able to describe any of her assailant's features. She does know, however, that he was a black man in his 20s or 30s. You have a man in custody who is being held in connection with the crime. Although the man was in the vicinity of the crime and has a reputation for making passes at white women in the community, you are absolutely convinced that this man is not guilty. Now, again, you have to trust me. You are absolutely convinced of this. Not a shadow of doubt that this man is not guilty. Nonetheless, the man looks guilty. To make matters worse, this morning the girl and her father came to the sheriff's office to identify the rapist. The girl, somewhat confused in the presence of her father, identified your suspect as being the rapist. You have lived in this community for all of your life. Given the racist attitudes that prevail throughout the community, you know that unless the rapist is brought to justice, there will be massive reprisals against the black community. A lot of innocent people will die. Schools will be firebombed. Black churches will be firebombed, etc., etc. You have the choice of framing your suspect for the crime or releasing him into protective custody. And this is the anachronistic part of it. Assume that you would be able to relocate this person to another community for his own safety. At this point, you don't have any clue whatsoever as to the identity of the real rapist, and it's highly unlikely that any new evidence in the case will be forthcoming. On the one hand, you don't want to frame an innocent man for a crime that will probably get him the death penalty. On the other hand, you are completely certain that unless someone is tried and convicted for the crime, there will be massive reprisals against the black community. You yourself do not harbor personally any racist attitudes. You want to do the right thing. What would you do? A, release the suspect into protective custody, or B, frame the suspect for the crime. Now, as you can imagine, this particular case, when actually presented to an audience, moves people more from the deontological perspective of the San Francisco earthquake into a more teleological perspective. But interestingly, not in a big way. Most people are very uncomfortable with the idea of a law enforcement officer intentionally framing someone for the crime, even though they know that without having some guilty party fingered for this, that other people will lose their lives. One of the things I think that that makes people feel very uneasy about framing the suspect for the crime is that you don't have control over other people's actions. Are you really sure that the violence would rise to the level of schools and churches being firebombed as a result of not having this suspect? So that's a very difficult thing, definitely, to unpack. I was struck, though, when I presented this case in Moscow in 1989. I had the opportunity to do a series of ethics lectures for the Moscow Motor Car Institute that was associated with the main Soviet manufacturer ZIL, which produced the truck that you see here that actually had not undergone a major design change since 1958. And then ZIL also produced the very large limousines that heads of state would use, shown here. Anyhow, to make a long story short, when I used the Southern Sheriff example to these students at the Moscow Motor Car Institute, who very much were teleological in their orientation, remarkably, they did not take the bait, if you will, of framing the suspect for the crime. Instead, their concern was that an official should not be corrupt in the practice of their responsibilities, because they've had plenty of exposure to corrupt officials within Soviet society. And so they argued that indeed the sheriff should release the person into protective custody. I thought that was really quite interesting. Now, our third example is called The Botanist in South America. And this is dated 1976. You are a botanist working in the jungles of South America. It is the 9th of May, 1976. One day, while exploring the exotic flora and fauna of the jungle habitat, you come upon an isolated village. It is approximately 2:00 p.m. While walking toward the village, you sense that something is wrong. Drawing near, you see that there are 100 or so villagers, men, women, and children, all lined up in the central street of the village. They are surrounded by 10 to 15 soldiers armed with automatic weapons. Peering at a distance, you see a stocky, bearded man who seems to be giving orders. Immediately, your blood runs cold. You recognize this man as Captain Alvarez, reportedly one of the cruelest leaders in the military. Captain Alvarez has a reputation for going out of his way to commit human rights abuses, and he reportedly tortures people routinely in the course of gathering information about the movements of rebel troops. By now, you are dead in your tracks, paralyzed by fear. Alvarez turns around and sees you. Immediately, he orders one of his soldiers to apprehend you. They grab your arms and escort you to Alvarez. By now, large beads of perspiration are dripping from your face. Your lips quiver in fear. Alvarez senses your fear and decides that he will have some fun with you today. Alvarez and his soldiers position you in front of the 100 villagers. He tells you that he was going to kill them all before you arrive, but now he is inclined to spare their lives. That is, if you will just kill one of the villagers yourself. Your choice, just one, and everyone else, the other 99, will survive. He instructs his soldiers to give you the loaded pistol. Your shaking hand clasps the cold, heavy weapon. Alvarez repeats that if you walk up and kill just one of the villagers, any one of your choice, he will spare the others. But if you refuse to comply, Alvarez promises that he will let you walk away unharmed yourself, but not before all of his soldiers kill the other villagers, men, women, and children. Now, you know beyond a shadow of a doubt that Alvarez is a man of his word and that he will honor all of his agreements to the letter. And again, you must accept that's part of the groundwork of this particular case. If you kill one, he will definitely let the others live. However, if you do not kill one, there's no doubt in your mind that he will instruct his soldiers to carry out the massacre. What would you do in this situation? Refuse to kill any of the villagers or kill one of the villagers to save the other 99. Now, regrettably, you don't have the option of killing Alvarez yourself. 3 of his soldiers have automatic weapons trained on you, and you could not get off a round before being cut to shreds. Now, what's striking about this case over against the Southern Sheriff is that where people felt ambivalent to frame the suspect for the crime, to take the teleological point of view, most of that reticence now is gone, that most people select option B, the teleological option. You kill one individual to save the other 99. However, there are a lot of really difficult questions to unpack. Like, okay, so if you decide to kill the one to save the 99, who would you choose? Would you ask for volunteers? Has anybody had any suicidal thoughts lately? How would you really go about doing that? And it's curious that I think most people opt for the notion of maybe shooting the oldest person or the perceived oldest person in the group. But that could be the worst possible thing, because you could have taken out a village elder, and maybe a younger person with little with less affiliation and time with the community would be viewed as the better person to be killed from the standpoint of the villagers themselves. So who would you choose? Do you think you really would be able to do this? And of course, the idea of shooting somebody down in cold blood is not a great prospect. Another thing that people think about is, well, what if I simply decide to lay down the gun and then join the rest of the villagers? Unfortunately, with that scenario, instead of 100 people dying, now it will be 101. And you would think, from the standpoint of the villagers, they're hoping that you're going to kill somebody, but they're probably assiduously avoiding eye contact with you at that point as you're trying to deliberate who are you going to shoot. The other possibility is to say, no, I will stay with a deontological standpoint and refuse to kill any of the villagers, because I am not actually killing the villagers. It's Alvarez who is killing the villagers. He's putting me in this impossible situation, forcing me to compromise my ethical beliefs in order to entertain him and save the lives of at least 99 of these villagers. My problem with the idea, though, of thinking, okay, I'm not killing the villagers, Alvarez is, and so I just need to walk away and then everybody dies, is thinking, I wonder how I would look at this from the standpoint of the villagers. If I was in that line, would I see the person refusing to actually shoot one person because it would violate their conscience? Would I see that as a selfish act, whereby if they had just had mustered the courage to kill one person, I could see another sunset? And of course, in this situation, Alvarez could come back next week and wipe out the entire community. And so I suppose you could say, well, it's not that big of a deal if people can live a little longer. But on the other hand, think about the fact that all of us are going to die at some point, and we put a tremendous amount of value in being able to live extra days and extra weeks and years of our lives, even though we know for sure that eventually all of us will die. So whether Alvarez comes back or doesn't come back would be immaterial, I would think, from the standpoint of the ordinary villager who wants to see another sunset, to live to see another sunset. Okay, our final example is the New York City police chief. And this is set not in any particular time frame, but you can imagine a scenario like this is unfortunately being potentially a realistic one. It is 12:45 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon in mid-January. You are the police chief of New York City. 1 hour ago, you learned from an absolutely reliable source that a thermonuclear weapon had been placed somewhere in Midtown Manhattan and is set to detonate at 2:30 p.m. You have no clue whatsoever concerning the location of the bomb. The analysts on your staff and 4 special agents from the FBI have strongly advised against evacuation, believing that it would be futile to evacuate the city within such a short span of time, and that this itself would cause a tremendous loss of life because of the ensuing panic. And I understand that during the middle of a workday in Manhattan, Manhattan is such a vertical city that you could not empty everyone else out of the skyscrapers and have enough room for people to stand on Manhattan Island because of the intense vertical nature of the city. So evacuation is out of the question. 10 minutes ago, 2 of your detectives apprehended one member of the terrorist group that planted the bomb. They believe he knows the location of the bomb, but they don't know for sure. One member of your staff has seen 2 terms of service in Iraq with special forces, and he's passed on a message that he would be willing to, quote, interrogate, unquote, the captured terrorist using some of the, quote, techniques of persuasion, unquote, that he had learned with special forces in Iraq. He asked for your written permission to use, quote, all means of persuasion and torture, unquote, during the interrogation until the information is secured from the suspect or until the suspect dies, end of quote. There is no time to contact the district attorney for an opinion on the matter, and the FBI special agents are unwilling to offer their opinion. They have made it clear, though, that you, as the New York City police chief, are the final decision maker. What would you do in this situation? Would you A, refuse to authorize the torture, or B, authorize the torture? What's striking about this particular case is that almost universally people opt for B, authorize the torture, the teleological alternative, because of the immensely destructive nature of the consequences of this situation. But what I find even more striking is that even though that is the conclusion that most people make, it is, in point of fact, almost has zero probability of actually bringing about a change in circumstances. I mean, realistically, it's 12:45 p.m. 10 minutes ago, you have the detectives that have apprehended somebody from the terrorist group, and you know that the bomb is going to be going off by 2:30. Do you really think that you're going to be successful in interrogating this person, that they're going to disclose the location of that bomb if they know the location of the bomb, which is itself a question mark? It's probably quite likely that that information was siloed. And so how will this actually change anything going ahead with the torture? It has such a small, infinitesimally small probability of success. Nonetheless, I think that most people believe you got to try to do something, and would see the teleological approach as being more desirable than refusing on moral grounds to authorize the torture. Now, having said all of that, isn't it interesting if I had just started this whole presentation on deontology and teleology with just a general question, hey, torture, what do you think about it? Do you think that the torture is the right thing for somebody to do? You would have made a moral judgment appropriately that torture is something that's wrong. But in this case, because of the extreme circumstances, maybe it would be justified, even though it has almost no chance of success. So, what we've learned from this process is that as we move through these cases, San Francisco earthquake, Southern Sheriff, South American botanist, New York City police chief, that even though one has tendencies to either be a deontological thinker or a teleological thinker, none of this is written in stone, and we see the potential for movement, in this case, a movement from deontology to teleology. Thank you so much for joining me for this presentation.